gotta eat the mic, apparently.
Oh, he's got a thing though.
All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. For the our second panel, which is going to focus on a discussion of Arizona mental health laws in Arizona. When Mary Lou sent me the names and information for the panelists, I'm basically a self-reflective person, and it really begged the question for me: what do you call a C- psychology student who couldn't get into law school? Moderator. That's my job. These folks are the A students and the overachievers. With us this morning on this panel, we have attorney Bernardo Garcia, who really has, since 1991, worked in criminal defense here in the Phoenix metropolitan area, really specializing in providing mental health services. I'm going to ditch the echo mic. But providing representation to clients with mental health disorders and those who speak Spanish, to frankly underserved populations when it comes to legal representation in our system. The biographies that are in the materials are certainly extensive. The most important thing a couple very, very important things about Bernardo. He has employed a golden doodle, and that is a remarkable element to an office, a law office. I wish that I could employ my boxer mix in the county. And how many people in this room were born in Joliet, Illinois? Bernardo and I were born in Joliet, Illinois.
Shadow of the prison.
Possibly switched at birth, and he's very fortunate that he didn't get my parents. Also with us today is attorney Nathan Jones, who works in northern Arizona, primarily in the behavioral health side of the system, providing representation for the REBA up there, and as general counsel for the Guidance Center, which has been providing community mental health services for decades in the Flagstaff area. Certainly the overachiever of the group, because one job just isn't enough. And we're absolutely privileged today to have Dr. Joel Dvoskin join us on this panel. He is a forensic psychologist, certainly a destination I could have gone had I been more dedicated to my studies in my years of college. What is absolutely stood out to me in looking at a career that has brought scholarly articles, consultation services, direct services all across our country, was that clearly it was a career inspired by the Johnny Cash song, "I've Been Everywhere." Because he most certainly has, and today he is with us, and we all benefit from his extraordinary experience working with folks throughout the criminal justice system, certainly individuals who are dealing with mental illness, and working at program reform, criminal justice reform. As we kick off this discussion about laws in Arizona, I want to start in a very positive place. And that is one of an opportunity for our panelists to reflect on in three very distinctly different careers, their observations of criminal justice system, criminal justice reform, the positive changes perhaps that we have seen in this system. So with that, Dr. Dvoskin, perhaps.
I'm not sure how positive. I guess I'll start with the positives. Arizona's way ahead of much of the United States. When you're driving your car in the mountains, sometimes you're riding along what you think is a flat area, and all of a sudden your car starts to get real sluggish, and you think there's something wrong with your car until you look in the rearview mirror and realize you just went up a mountain. But because the Rocky Mountains are in front of you, you feel like you haven't made any progress. Well, Arizona's made a ton of progress. In community mental health, we're in the top quarter of states. We're not a rich state, but we're in the top quarter of states in community mental health. Our inpatient bed availability, we're in the bottom quarter of states. But I think that's a better place to be. We're about right in the middle in terms of per capita spending on mental health of the states. But we've done a lot of really progressive things. Largely that's because of Arnold versus Sarn in Maricopa County, our biggest population center. That's the positive. But there's also a lot of work yet to be done. There's a mountain in front of us. And I just want to kind of randomly comment about a few pieces of this. One of them is when we talk about serious mental illness, most people see that as a diagnostic question. And the DSM is not our friend here. The DSM categorizes people in a way that's not very helpful. Schizophrenia doesn't cause people to be disabled. Schizophrenia is just a name we call people. What disables people is confusion or hearing voices and dimensional diagnosis. What is it that we're treating? What is it that's wrong? What is it that's interfering with a successful life? That's what matters. And when it's not dealt with, that's what leads people into the criminal justice system, not their diagnosis. There's plenty of people with diagnoses of every mental illness you can think of who are living perfectly safe lives in the community and not hurting anybody. The vast majority of people with the diagnosis. The next one is that, and I mean, I hope I don't hurt anybody's feelings with this, but the jail versus treatment, that's a false dichotomy. A very, very small percentage of crimes that are committed by people with mental illness and a tiny percentage of serious crimes are due to the symptoms of the mental illness. Probably about 10%, although it's really hard, the research is difficult to do. Generally speaking, people with mental illness commit crimes for the same reasons that people without mental illness commit crimes. Stress, poverty, rage, etc. If all you do is get people treatment, we know now from some great studies, you asked me during the break and I'll be happy to give you some names, but if all you do is improve mental health treatment, you don't get better criminal justice outcomes except for that small percentage of crimes that are due to the symptoms of mental illness. You have to include criminogenic variables, the things that cause people to commit crimes. The next point I wanted to make is that the problems that were talked about today are not just about people with mental illness. We lock up way too many people for way too many reasons, and the overwhelming one is social adversity, poverty, racism. Just walk around a prison and you will not, if you're looking for an evil genius, do not go to the Arizona State Prison. I used to work there. You will not find Hannibal Lecter. He's running for office somewhere. What you'll find is people who are bad at life. They're bad at everything. For God's sake, they're even bad at crime. Every frickin' one of them got caught. They're not good at stuff. And when I started as a youngster in the prison system, you worked all day or you learned stuff all day or you didn't get, you got two, we call it 2 for 1. You got 2 days of credit if you went to school or got a job. And you got 1 day of credit if you didn't work or go to school. Well, guess what people did all day? They worked and went to school. They graduated prison with degrees in welding and all kinds of skills. Now, largely because of money, most of the time in jails and prison, a high percentage of it is dead time, where people don't do much of anything except mess with each other. And as a result, we're spending a fortune to make people worse. If the criminal justice system was a boxing match, there would be an investigation because it looks like we're trying to lose. We're making people worse at tremendous public expense. Now, I've locked people up for most of my life. I don't not believe in prison. I just think we should use it for the people who need it the most. And it might be half of the people that are currently in prison in the United States. It might be a quarter of people that would really pose a public safety risk if they weren't in prison. For everybody else, we would be much better off doing the kind of things that the last panel talked about. When the juvenile justice facility in Show Low disappeared, they had to start thinking much more creatively about how to keep kids out of the system. The last point I want to make is that I wish I had a whole day to just talk about competency system in Arizona. It's an abomination. If you steal a sandwich and you were allowed to plead guilty, you might do 4 days in jail. Most likely you would just get fingerprinted and released because they don't have room. That's what the sheriffs would like. They don't want a whole bunch of people who steal sandwiches because they were hungry, and they were hungry because they were mentally ill in their jail. But what happens now is it takes weeks or even months to get found incompetent, which you're in jail for. And then in Arizona, amazingly, you stay in jail for restoration instead of being sent to a psychiatric hospital, which is what the law used to require. And you stay there getting, I almost said a bad word, I'm really trying hard to not curse at these things. I worked in prison for too long and I have a potty mouth. You get lousy medical, psychiatric care in jail, but now they have a program they call competency restoration where somebody comes and tells you what a prosecutor is twice a week. Except that that's not why you were incompetent. A small percentage of people are incompetent due to ignorance. The vast majority are incompetent because they're psychotic and what they need is good psychiatric care. Well, if you're looking for that in the jail, you're looking in the wrong place. At least in Pima and Maricopa County, where I know something about it. And it's not the people, they're good people that are trying their best in there, but they may as well be, they're pushing a rock up a hill and it just keeps rolling back down because they don't have good enough psychiatric care for anybody. And heck, most of the people I know who are incompetent, they've been arrested so many times, they already know the prosecutor's not their pal. They could teach the competency course, except that they're psychotic and they're confused and they can't talk to their lawyer or they think their lawyer is Satan. We're fixing the wrong thing, and I could go on. I apologize, you guys.
No worries. And with certainty, we will touch on that issue, I think, and it'll be woven throughout our discussion with regard to restoration to competency. laws associated with that. Nathan, this is not a competition today, but as an overachiever, I say to you, top that.
Well, I don't know if I can top that, especially, our stance at NARBA Institute and at its various affiliated companies, one of which provides the direct behavioral health services. We're not necessarily advocating for things in terms of legislative change. There are rules and policies that are set by persons wiser than us through elected processes that we respect. We're just trying to provide the best service we can to the people that we serve in a system that, as the doctor mentioned, that deserves a lot of accolades on the whole. On the Medicaid side, it was the first state to adopt a managed care system. It is now in the process of being at the forefront of integrated care, which integrates physical and behavioral health in a way that sort of recognizes that the brain actually is part of the body. There are a lot of great things to be said about Arizona and its system in my experience. If you want to talk about some challenges, though, there are of course some that we see. A big one for us is a lot of the things related to Title 36, the civil commitment, which should be talked about because it is a significant piece of the alternative to that incarceration setting or to the criminal justice process. There are aspects of it that are particularly challenging in rural areas. You have to think about the fact that successfully pursuing an order requires, under current law, 2 psychiatrists, a social worker, another witness, typically a crisis worker, someone to do a physical exam, typically a nurse practitioner. It's extremely, that's essentially our entire inpatient unit. It's incredibly it would not be possible to bring those folks into a jail setting to expedite that process in a way that will allow us to do it outside the facility setting. There are a number of challenges with respect to once the order is obtained. We have a really great system, I think in a lot of ways, for the process of getting it, and certainly down here in Maricopa it has a lot of staff behind it and a lot of folks that are focused exclusively on it. But what do we do once the order is obtained? There's an expectation on providers to essentially adopt a surveillance type of function, despite they don't have probation backgrounds. It's hard to enforce the orders. It's hard for law enforcement when they try to work with us to enforce them. Questions come up like, well, yes, statute says I can take the non-compliant person into custody based on the medical director's order, but it doesn't say that it substitutes for a search warrant, so I can't go into the house. So many unresolved questions and gray areas that come up is a challenge. Another one would be there are federal issues that, the number of psychiatric beds in Arizona was recently mentioned. And nobody wants to advocate for any kind of reinstitutionalization. It's something to be proud of that we don't see inpatient treatment as any kind of a primary vehicle, but where it is unavoidable, we do have that lack. I think that's been acknowledged. This past legislative session, HB 2754 passed, which directs a study of that kind of psychiatric bed-in availability, and it also, at some point, is going to create a new category of facility called a secure behavioral health residential facility. This brings me to a point about all of these other issues that are potentially criminogenic. We have a word for that, the social determinants of health. Of course, criminality is not in itself a symptom of mental illness, but all these other things contribute to it. The poverty, the lack of housing. It's hard to be looked to as the solution to all of those things. Residential facilities, for example, are a class of facility that we have in the state. There's not enough of them. It's hard to arrange them appropriately. And they are outpatient settings. They are also not group homes. There is a expectation that they'll get better and discharge eventually. There is discharge planning. They're not locked, which makes it hard if someone's under court order and non-compliant because, of course, in our state, commitment doesn't mean committed to a facility. It generally means that you have an order that says you will comply with an outpatient treatment plan. So the state is responding to these things. We're already seeing those laws passed. I want to see where things like HB 2754 go now that it's been signed into law, but I want to highlight that as some of the challenges. Other obstacles to beds for the people who really do need them when it really is a least restrictive level of care that works. Federal level, the IMD exclusion. Show of hands, how many folks know what that is? So we got some, but it essentially is a federal decision meant to, admirable goal, right, of not wanting federal funds to create more institutions or large institutions, so you exclude from Medicaid funding dedicated psychiatric facilities of over 16 beds for adults. Creates an obstacle, especially in rural communities where we're capped. We have exactly 16 beds for that reason. Otherwise, we can't have a length of stay that exceeds 15 days. These are just some quick highlights that come immediately to mind, but that, you know, on moving boldly forward into integrated care, discussing civil commitment and how it works here in Arizona and what could be done to improve it, especially in rural areas where we don't have the expertise. There's the competency evaluation issue, a challenge for us as well. There's a nationwide shortage of psychiatrists and psychologists, and an even more acute shortage of ones who are interested in doing forensic work. So that's just filling those positions. That's why it takes so long to get a Rule 11 evaluation. Someone has to conduct it, and we have to recruit for those positions. It's difficult to do, it's difficult to attract. We can expand access to telemedicine and telehealth as a partial solution, but we also need to think about the various settings where these things may take place and the challenges they have. So anyway, I want to be on a positive note, though, because a lot of these things are probably nationwide issues that Arizona, I can already see, is aware of them. I can already see that I don't say much that people can't sympathize with or that people don't see as an issue. I think there's a lot of great minds that are working on it and strides that have been made and continue to be made in a system that really is at the forefront in a lot of ways. And so there are some dialogues to be had and some discussions to be had, and to the extent I can contribute or assist with them, that's why I'm privileged to be up here.
Bernardo?
You know, I look at things a little bit differently. I understand that there are great needs for the mental health community, and I represent mainly people who, through no fault of their own, suffer from mental illness and are stuck in the criminal justice system. But as I look at where I was 30 years ago and where we are now, I'm optimistic because I do see progress. I mean, when I started, the idea of CIT going through the different counties, I'm not certain that that was something on their radar. There are some very conscientious judges at Desert Vista, at the mental health court. There's a veterans court. These are all new innovations that I think have made progress. And I'm encouraged by them because I'm hoping the trajectory of that progress will continue. And I guess the way I look at my job and the way it's evolved is when I started, it was my job to communicate to a prosecutor that prosecutor needed to take a chance on my client, that prosecutor, knowing that my client suffered from mental illness, was going to give my client an advantage, because we were putting things into place to assure my client's success in the future. And I think when I first started, many line prosecutors would have thought of what I was doing, and I think many line judges would have thought of what I was doing as merely a defense attorney's trick. And as a matter of fact, that's why we changed our insanity laws in this state, because it was looked at as a defense attorney's trick. When I speak to prosecutors now, not all of them, but many of them, realize that what I'm trying to do is to serve my client, and that they should take a chance on my client, because we're putting into effect those things that will assure that individual's success in the future. That dialogue wasn't there 25 years ago. It's there more often now. That dialogue with police officers as to not necessarily filing charges against my client, but getting them care, is more often there than it was 25 years ago. So while I acknowledge, and that's how I make my living, that it's not a perfect system, it's getting better, and I'm encouraged by that. And I think that there's a lot of judges, prosecutors, defense attorneys, social workers, law enforcement that have really tried to improve the situation for the mentally ill. And as much as things may be lacking in some areas, they deserve some credit, because progress has been made over this last quarter decade.
And that was, and largely the theme also this morning of the conversation, progress, opportunity in the future. This is the time of year throughout Arizona that County Board of Supervisors, folks at the Supreme Court, every municipality throughout the state is thinking about what legislative reform efforts may have importance, what leverage, what effort, what energy might we consider putting behind statutory changes, reform. Is there anything any message, any thought you would give to political leaders and others in positions of thinking about what is it we do, what would be an important thing to try to advance a meaningful change in statute that could improve this situation? Is there something?
Well, I'd like to rephrase that question, because I deal mostly with the courts, and I think there's some administrative things that we can learn from some of our courts that should be adopted by all of our courts. The city of Tempe and the city of Glendale have marvelous mental health diversion programs. Those programs need to be adopted in all jurisdictions throughout the state. We need to have a more meaningful diversion program on the felony level. I mean, it just doesn't happen in Maricopa County. There's some diversion, but we need to have a more meaningful diversion program in Superior Court. And these are things that can be done by our administrators and our judicial officers without having to worry about whether or not we can make it through the legislature and a governor's signature. So some of our blueprints are already out there. They just need to be adopted by more courts and by higher courts.
Just to show of hands, how many prosecutors are with us today?
I predicted one that wouldn't need to be here, and I was wrong. It's 0.
Absolutely, there is a power in administrative levels and decision makers to really, we talked about this morning, share information, communicate what programs are successful. Here's the avenue to implement. Diversion programs are at the heart of one of these serious challenges, particularly in superior courts, of providing the access because the access funnels through at prosecutorial discretion of, do we have a diversion program or we don't? And that picture in Cochise is, one of a real challenge around felony charges to build diversion capacity. But information sharing, as you mentioned, is so critical in getting folks to understand the value. Dr. Dvoskin?
Ed's question about the prosecutors is a brilliant one. I'm going to tell you, if you want to do something to accomplish these goals, take a prosecutor to lunch. Every single one of you, just go find a prosecutor, take them to lunch. And I'll tell you, first of all, it's a free meal, so they'll take it. And the second thing is give them an award. Catch them doing something right and give them an award for it, and they'll show up to get the award. But it's depressing in one sense, but this is hard, but it's not complicated. The prosecutors have more power to fix why we're here than everybody in this room put together. They control everything. So remember that person who stole a sandwich that's going to spend $100,000 of county money to be in jail for a year and a half, instead of giving them $5 for a frickin' sandwich, right? That's not conservative values. That's not a good use of public monies, right? And so you say to the defense attorney, well, why don't you just plead him out? Well, they say, I can't plead a guy out if he's incompetent. That violates his constitutional rights. But you know what you could do is drop the charges after 5 days of being in jail or 15 days of being in jail and save the county a fortune and not ruin this poor guy's life, and then maybe figure out a way to get him some food stamps so he doesn't have to steal his next sandwich because he's hungry. It's not rocket science. It's just that the people who get it don't have control over this. A defense attorney can beg a prosecutor to drop the charges, but ever since Willie Horton, I don't know how many of you remember Willie Horton ruined America. Because every politician's greatest fear in life is releasing the next Willie Horton. God forbid I should lose my job as a public servant. And so as a result, we're preventing some more sandwiches from being stolen, and ironically giving the guy more expensive sandwiches in jail every day for the next year. What planet does that make sense? It's not Earth, that I know for sure.
And I think that a common frustration of folks in the criminal justice system is about who has control. And Bernardo, earlier this morning, you made the point about the defense attorney trick, the compelling argument and the personal, depending on frankly relationships and communication, give an opportunity for change to this person, let the systems that exist be an opportunity. And that, frankly, is where we stand across a system of where diversion opportunity, decisions to dismiss after we've had those days that would be the punishment for the offense. Additional thoughts on where we stand with our legal processes and some of those very simple solutions?
So I'll echo what both of my colleagues here have said, which is that first, there is so much that can be done that's outside the legislature. It is absolutely true that under the current situation, that much power has, whether it's major things and issues like mandatory minimums and that sort of thing that really transfer a tremendous amount of authority from judges to prosecutors. That's real. And so is prosecutorial discretion. And we see up in the north and in the rural, we see lots of enlightened and responsible use of that discretion. We do see a lot of dismissed charges. We see a lot of Rule 11s that result in not competent, not restorable on a minor charge that really leaves them with little to do from there but to refer it to the Title 36 civil process. But of course, in order to be in mental health treatment does not house someone or feed them. And there's often an expectation that it will. I get a lot of, well, what's their placement? There isn't necessarily a placement. You get a lot of words that really come from the developmental disability world, but there's going to be a medical necessity decision. Maybe substance abuse is the issue, and that by itself isn't a civil commitment qualifying criteria. There's a lot of reasons why we haven't been able to look to that system to solve homelessness and poverty and all these other contributing factors. So I think that while I mentioned earlier that it's not our role to advocate for legislative change, it's also important not to discount the need for legislatures to also take hard looks at these issues, whether it's at the federal level related to the IMD exclusion that I was mentioning earlier, and at the state level, how we can streamline processes like Title 36 that are set by statute, how we can augment them with options, how we can look at what is covered. What do we consider to be a healthcare service? This is ripe for discussion as Arizona heads into its 1115 waiver process under which the entire Medicaid program exists here. That process may present some opportunities to talk about social determinants of health and how they can be folded in better with that system. But I think we also need to think, well, sequential intercept. We talk a lot about services and courts at the felony level, but we see a lot of folks where it's miles and miles of misdemeanors. Just minor charge after minor charge after minor charge that either gets dismissed because Rule 11 either found them not competent or found them restorable, but it wasn't worth the expense or the time, and they're doing exactly what the doctor mentioned, which is dismissing the charge. But what next? And what services can there be? We don't have, intensive probation for somebody who stole that proverbial sandwich, right? It's not a felony. So we need to look at the limited jurisdiction courts and how they can be all part of it as well, and what kind of resources are steered in that direction. So those would be some of my thoughts.
I promised Mary Lou that I would talk about mental health law, like law stuff, which is dicey for me because they're lawyers and I'm not. But if you know the Clark case, where the Supreme Court said it was okay for the state of Arizona to say that you cannot introduce evidence of psychosis on the question of mens rea. Mens rea means guilty mind. And this is legal stuff, but it ruins people's lives. So Mr. Clark killed a police officer and credibly claims that he thought that it wasn't a human being, that it was an alien. But he certainly intended to pull the trigger, and he knew that the gun makes a loud noise and causes damage, but he didn't think he was killing a person. And he was not allowed to introduce evidence on on that question. And mens rea is an essential component. You can't commit murder if you didn't intend to kill somebody. So the court said, well, that was okay. Well, so it said Arizona can do that. Well, my daddy taught me the worst reason in the world to do anything is because you can. Just because you can doesn't mean that you should. And Arizona should change its statute immediately to say that you can introduce evidence on any essential component of the crime. Now, the reason Arizona made that decision has to do with something called diminished capacity, which is a very different thing. Diminished capacity is a narrow piece of law, and it's pretty much the only time it's used, and it's in about 14 states, something like that now, is if you kill somebody in the heat of passion, the law says it's murder unless you didn't have time, you didn't have a cooling off period. So if there's a delay in the time between when you had felt passionate about it, and I tell you who it's written for. It's written for rich people that shoot their wife when they catch them sleeping with somebody else. And if you're rich, it knocks it down to manslaughter, even though you had a week to think about it. And they say, well, but he had an anxiety disorder, so he didn't use the cooling off period. And Arizona rightly said, that doesn't make much sense to us. So Arizona doesn't have diminished capacity. And if you think about it for a week and kill somebody, even if you have a mental illness, it doesn't change the fact that you premeditated their murder. But this is very different than that. This is an essential component of, I didn't think I was killing a person. And even if the court would have eventually found him guilty, he certainly had a due process right to state that case. The Clark decision was a horrible decision, in my opinion, and it could be fixed by the legislature of Arizona because the Supreme Court didn't say you have to do a stupid thing. It just said you could. So that would be a really good change, in my opinion.
Hey, let me follow up on that, because I realize that the diminished capacity is, and I'm told this every week by prosecutors, diminished capacity is not a defense in Arizona. The question then for many of us should be not only pursuing a change in the law, but what do we do with our clients who have diminished capacity? What do we do with these individuals who are suffering from mental illness and therefore should not be treated the same as someone else? And I think that's where good lawyering comes in. That's where working with prosecutors comes in. That's where working with judges comes in. You know, diminished capacity may not be a defense, but it is something for mitigation.
Yes.
And it is something for plea negotiations. And it is something for consideration as far as how we're going to resolve a case, either with a trial or short of trial. So again, I come back to what I was saying at the beginning. I think we're in a healthier position than we were 25 years ago. I don't think we're where we want to be, but I think we're in a healthier position such that if someone now has a diminished capacity issue, then at least the discussion between defense and the state can occur, where I'm not certain it occurred 25 years ago.
And you could also put that in statute as a mitigating factor, would probably help encourage those conversations as well. And I just want to add one piece to this, which is there's a case before the Supreme Court called Kahler or Kahler, I'm not sure how you pronounce it, Kahler. And the question is, there's 4 states, either 4 or 5 states that don't have an insanity defense, and the Supreme Court has finally decided to hear whether there's a constitutional requirement to have an insanity defense. And it's going to be 5-4, and we don't know which way it's going to go. But the facts in Kaler are not very good. He did not have a psychotic illness. He had an anxiety disorder. And so the cynical part of me says that the Supreme Court purposely accepted a case with bad facts because they wanted to find the wrong way. But most of my law professor friends think that the court's going to say, yeah, you do have to have an insanity defense. Arizona has one, so it probably won't affect Arizona, but it's a really important case nationally.
You know, when it comes to the, I'm going to call the mens rea exclusion, this current and very long-standing doctrine here that you can use mental health evidence to establish an insanity defense, but you can't use it to raise reasonable doubt about intent. I'll go back before Clark, back before Mott, back before all of that, and Monroe as well, more recently, and look to its original genesis in Chance, a case in 1965, where at the time a significant part of the justification for that idea was this same kind of, now what? What do we do with the diminished capacity folks? At the time, one of the pieces of rationale that was cited was that Arizona had not adopted any civil commitment statutes or the civil commitment sections of the Model Penal Code as it was at that time. This is long ago, 50 some odd years ago. Well, a lot's changed since then. I don't take a position personally as to whether it should change. I'm not a prosecutor, I'm not a defense attorney, but if it does change, what I care about is, does it help get people who need treatment into treatment and perhaps out of incarceration settings? Because of course the other thing that tends to happen is all the examples you get are going to be appellate cases, which you don't see appeals of run-of-the-mill situations very often. You don't see a whole lot of published decisions, so what you get is facts that illustrate people that are very hard to sympathize with. They're all homicide cases. But of course, murder is not the only specific intent crime in existence. So, you know, what if I wanted diminished capacity evidence to come in on a burglary about whether I was really trying to commit a crime inside the house I was breaking into or what have you? You know, there are things besides murder, but murder is all you end up reading about, and it leads to some unsympathetic facts. I mean, there's, although sometimes you can get some more interesting facts, like the Mott situation, which was actually a felony murder case, meaning the person didn't actually commit the killing literally, but rather they failed to prevent child abuse, and they tried to, the defense was trying to introduce battered women's syndrome as a defense, i.e. her desire to protect the abuser, related to defending against the mother who had gotten a first-degree murder charge for not taking the child that her husband beat to the hospital. She went down on first-degree murder for that. She didn't beat the child, she just didn't take him to the hospital because of that precluded evidence. So facts seem to matter, and trying to illustrate it in terms of the myriad situations where it could come up, because I'm sure defense counsel, like you said, gets told it's not a defense all the time. Probably not all in murder cases. So, you know, how we could look at that rule or what kind of a dialogue we could have. Another important point was, like I was saying earlier, when it all originally had this genesis and all the well-established precedent that's followed it has been based on a case that originally, back in 1965, was partially premised on the idea that we didn't have civil commitment. Well, we do now, so do all 50 states. We're in a minority on excluding the evidence. Only about 14 states have rules similar to ours. And so if there is to be a dialogue about it, you also have to do that you have to hit that what then point. How do we look at the titles? Because, you know, you might be concerned about, oh, well, if this leads to a conviction on some much lesser charge where release will happen, or just outright acquittal, you know, which could happen if you've failed to prove an element of the offense, where intent is an element of the offense. Well, what happens now? What's the alternative? Maybe it's not regular Title 36, which is typically an order that essentially says you have to go to your outpatient appointments, the court has more options than just that. But it also would need places to put them. And like I said, we're creating new licensure categories already with this new law that eventually, probably take a few years to draft the rules, but the secure behavioral health residential facilities and that sort of thing under the new bill. I'm just saying, this is a long-standing, very well-established, pretty much axiomatic rule that lawyers just know. If it is going to change, will that help us get people who need treatment into treatment and out of incarceration type of settings, while also balancing that against the safety of society and the victims' families in the case of serious offenses and that sort of thing? But it's a dialogue that seems to be worth having without necessarily me personally just prescribing some kind of universal answer from here, which I don't have.
You know, I want to take the opportunity, because there is law enforcement here, and talk about the most common situation that I see in my office, and just a recommendation. The most common situation that I see in my office is a family has a loved one who is in a mental health crisis. They are unequipped to handle the situation. They call law enforcement to help with their loved one who has a mental health crisis, and when the law enforcement gets there, the person who is in a crisis will either flay or pull away or sometimes spit or kick or do something foolish because they're in crisis. And then you have a family who is seeking help and assistance, looking at their loved one being arrested, charged with a felony, and if they have a prior for marijuana, then they're looking at mandatory prison time. My only comment is, just as I believe the dialogue is better now between prosecutors and defense attorneys and judges, in this particular area, there needs to be a better dialogue between the mental health community and law enforcement. With law enforcement, I hope will do more and more increasingly is take that person to UPC or whatever their county facility is for mental health, and not to the jail. Because once you get them to the jail, then they're going to have to hire me, and we're going to have a long process to get them out of it. When all that was happening was family was asking for help. So for those law enforcement out there, I'd ask you to consider how you're going to respond to that situation, what you're going to do as a community. But it is unfortunate that a family with a loved one in crisis then sees a loved one in the criminal justice system.
I feel like applauding for that comment. That happens many times a day. That is the most common scenario. The one way government could help, first of all, the police officers in the room are probably the wrong people to say it to, because they already do what you want. It's the police officers that aren't likely to be at a meeting like this, that either haven't received the same training or don't have the same options to take a person. But what government could do, in addition to supporting even more CIT, is why would a police officer take somebody to jail instead of to a mental health crisis setting? And the answer is because they got a sergeant screaming at them to get moving because there's 3 burglaries they have to respond to, and they have to stay at the emergency room for 6 hours while they're waiting for whatever has to happen in the ER, for an evaluation, for somebody to say, yeah, we'll take charge of this person. In New York City, we worked out a deal where the police could come and go within 1 hour. We basically got the ER wanted some stuff from the police, so we got the ER to agree at Bellevue to agree that they would move anybody the police brought in to the front of the line. That's all it took. It didn't cost a penny. And it sped up so that a police officer basically took the same amount of time to book somebody in jail that it would take to hand them over to a crisis center of some sort. So that's something government could facilitate that would address this common issue that Bernardo was talking about. In response to Nathan's case, I just want to tell you one example. I had a client who we received who had broken the picture window of a furniture store, and the police found him sound asleep in a bed in the window that he thought he lived there. And he was charged with burglary. Well, he thought he lived there. He did not have the intent to illegally break into a building. Our system doesn't have a lot of common sense.
You know, I want to take a second and just mention, by the way, that when it comes to those crisis stabilization units, which are essentially here in Arizona, they're 24-hour chairs that enables us to classify them as outpatient settings, which is important because of the IMD exclusion mentioned earlier and our cap of the 16 beds. Well, a chair is not a bed, right? So it reclines. But the important thing is that it provides an alternative, and that's the role. And that's what we want to try to do the best, is provide those alternatives, because they do use them. And by the way, I can tell you just from personal experience, the counties, the law enforcement people, whether it's in City of Flagstaff or whether it's Coconino County or down in Yavapai County, my experience has been that they absolutely are committed to utilizing those jail alternatives wherever they possibly can, and I see that commitment at the highest levels. They don't want people in the jail unnecessarily, and I don't think they need any convincing. I think they are key and vital allies who should be applauded for what they're already doing, and we just need to provide them the alternatives that they can use and how best we can fund those and ensure their stability, because we're all on that same team. Provide the alternatives, they will use them, and they do.
One of the common themes, threads throughout this discussion, regardless of the statutory environment, the local environment, the opportunities that are presented for formal training, who your sergeant is, who the chief is, who the judge is, that by knowing the existing environment, the law, the resources, sharing that information with others, providing formal mechanisms for people to get the information about resources and services, to avoid engaging in change for change's sake. If, as Nathan has said several times, if it doesn't improve an outcome to treatment access, is a statutory reform really the thing that we're depending on to make a system better? And to Bernardo's comments throughout of having influence and knowing the needs of a client and representing that person, given the circumstances that exist, to the best professional capacity, is so very, very fundamentally important in the work every professional in this room does. One of the things when I was reviewing the backgrounds of the panelists that struck me is that Dr. Dvoskin, a fair amount of your work has been in consulting with regard to architecture and design of facilities, jails, hospitals. And one of the current factors in Arizona, about half our counties have jail districts that generate specific tax revenues to enhance services in jails. A lot of our facilities are very outdated. And I guess, and for, I know Bernardo and your visitations of clients in jails and work with clients, I'm sure there's been discussion of the environments themselves at jail. For me as a county administrator, it's liability inducing. And we do see and are seeing throughout Arizona a lot of claims coming from the environment. So it just, for me, the question is, I mean, how does the design of our facilities and the environments that we've created there help or hurt our progress in better serving the mentally ill?
You want to go first?
Go ahead.
So if I had a limited amount of money, it's very likely I would spend more of it on people than on the building, to be honest with you. If you're building a new facility, then you should build it right, because it doesn't cost any more to build it correctly than it does. Retrofitting old jails is an expensive business. And if I had more people who made a better living so that the ones with good experience didn't have to quit, and better training, I can overcome some of the limitations of a physical plant more effectively than by changing the physical plant with the same number, type, and untrained staff, number one. The exception to that is suicide prevention. Suicide prevention is by far what costs jails the most money. It adds to the public liability, and it kills people. So whether you're on the right or the left, you should be adamantly opposed to jail suicide. Now, the way that you can't fix a whole bad jail, but you can fix a certain number of cells. So if you enlarge the vision panel so that it's much easier to see into a cell, if you make sure that there's nothing from which it's easy to attach, there's nothing to which it's easy to attach a ligature, so it's more difficult to hang yourself. And if you make sure there's no sharps in the room, you can make it much more challenging to kill yourself in jail. It's never impossible, but it doesn't have to be easy. And in most jails, it's easy. There's plenty of things you can hang stuff from. There's sheets and there's clothing, and you rip them up and you hang yourself. Or there's sharps in the room, and if you rip this vein open longitudinally, even if we get there quick, it's pretty hard to stop the bleeding. So when I visit a jail and they can't afford to fix the whole jail, which is almost always, what I tell them is at least fix enough cells that so a quick word about suicide. Some people are on acute suicide watch. It's easy to prevent them from killing themselves. You just put somebody right outside their cell staring at them. And that works, but it's expensive. So jails do that when people are known to be at acute suicide risk. What's really hard is people that are at chronic suicide risk, people who are in despair. They've tried to kill themselves previously, but they say they're okay now, and you can't read their mind. So they're gonna be a high risk the whole time they're in jail, but you can't keep them on suicide watch the whole time they're in jail. It's cruel to them, and it's inordinately expensive to the jail. So what we recommend to jails that have that challenge is identify those people and put them in one housing unit or a part of a housing unit, and clean the heck out of that housing unit so that it's really hard, and maybe put an extra staff member there so that you've got better observation. That if you've been watching television, this Epstein thing they're talking about, a half-hour watch would have kept him alive. It's absolutely, you could kill yourself 4 times in half an hour. That's never kept anybody from killing themselves. I mean, they were short-staffed. That's why he was able to kill himself, and they're blaming the victims of it, or this poor staff that were working overtime, and one of them wasn't even a corrections officer, and the problem was that they had a lousy budget, and they had a hiring freeze. But nobody, I mean, when's the last time you heard a politician say, "This is my fault"? So, but that's how I would do it in a cost-effective way. It's not free, by the way. You still got to spend a little bit of money. But we did that in 6 prisons in Georgia, and I think I actually went around with the maintenance dude, and most of the stuff we fixed it while we were walking around. And I think we spent 50 grand on 6 prisons to at least create some safe spaces in all of the high-risk areas. So there's always a way to make it better, but fixing it 100% is a really, really expensive proposition.
Well, I don't know much about jail facilities, but hospitals sure can sympathize. Ours is accredited by a place called the Joint Commission, which surveys for Medicare conditions of participation. And let me tell you, there are national patient safety goals and various other things that are extremely focused on ligature. There is ligature equipment for everything. There are ligature-resistant doorknobs, ligature-resistant screws, ligature-resistant power outlets, special drop ceilings if you can't have a solid ceiling. I mean, this is the #1 issue there. They've got surveyors that walk around with a string, drape it over things.
I do that. I carry a handkerchief and I pull myself off the ground with it.
And it sounds like, again, the prevailing message there is systems dependent on people. And people, connected people, caring people with the right information to equip them to make the right decisions and lead the right reform efforts, to put our energies at the things that do matter. As we wrap up this discussion, I'd like to give each of our panelists an opportunity to just make any final and closing comments for the group today. And again, these folks are going to be circulating and around if you've got questions to ask them, and certainly willing to provide some more information. But Bernardo, you want to kick us off?
You know, when I first started practicing law, I had an older attorney tell me that a litigator argues and a good litigator persuades. I think we're at a stage in our community where we're able to persuade prosecutors and judges about doing the right thing. It's just a matter of us going out and doing that, doing our work, and not shouting, but persuading.
Well said.
Well, I'll echo that. I think there's a general sense that when it comes to the mental health related issues, everybody's on the same team and basically has the same fundamental goals. A lot of interests that have previously pointed at each other or been adverse to one another it's not the same. They're working together on a shared community problem, and I agree with that sentiment. I think the takeaway would be, think about, as you're down here at these conferences, think about those early pieces of that sequential intercept timeline or funnel. Think about the minor charges. Think about the civil processes. Think about the collateral consequences of things. Think about social determinants of health. And all of those factors that have not traditionally been regarded as healthcare or criminal justice related, but that feed into both. And finally, think about the perspectives, the importance of a diverse range of perspectives. We want to hear more from the, in any change or anything that gets discussed. Involve the peers, involve the people with lived experience in those systems, involve every voice you can think of, involve the rural communities, because that's where these dialogues can go. And as I mentioned, sometimes we can make a policy to solve a Maricopa problem that might be different in the north, or might not exist in the north or in a more rural county, or that presuppose the existence of resources that might not be there. So I just say, I think there's a great sentiment that we're all fundamentally on the same team, and let's just view opportunities like this as the opportunities for dialogue that they are. And I hope to see more and increasingly diverse perspectives contribute to that discussion, and then providers like ours and systems like ours, how they can best serve these populations and help these people and essentially find the yes.
So I guess the first thing I would say is look around you, and the word diversity leaps off the page at me. You really got to expand the diversity of this group. The criminal justice system disproportionately affects people of color and people from communities of poverty, so many of whom aren't here. Also, Arizona is like most states, extremely urban, Phoenix and Tucson, and extremely rural. The Navajo County has this huge impoverished reservation. Their problems and solutions are very different than those of the cities. I was really excited to hear the first panel and hear some of the rural solutions that are being experimented with, and pretty successfully. So I think doing more of things that work. The one word that we haven't mentioned nearly enough today is housing. If you don't have a place to stay, your chances of staying out are almost zero statistically. The not putting money into housing, in the short run, is really economically cool. You can save money this fiscal year, but the expenditures that emerge from people being unhoused, I think probably vastly exceed the costs it would have taken to house people. Now here's the problem. What is American government really bad at? And the answer is moving money from one silo to another. If the county's eating a cost, the state doesn't care. The governor says, I cut taxes, and the counties have to raise taxes to make up for the difference. And our counties are in fiscal danger, but we get to say that we cut state taxes. They should be required to add all the taxes and costs together and say, how much is it costing the taxpayer? Not, can I say I've cut federal taxes, so I'm a great guy, and the states have to eat it, or the counties. I guess if I could change one thing about the criminal justice system really quickly, I would move discretion back to the judges. Judges used to exercise discretion, and every once in a while there would be a horrible example that made the front page, but it was always in the light of day and with scrutiny. DAs, and luckily we have some really good county attorneys in Arizona, but they exercise discretion behind closed doors, and their incentive is to clear cases. And if you notice during the campaigns, how do they run for office? By percentage of guilty pleas. So it's to their interest to say, I'm going to charge you with first-degree murder, but if you'll plead to 74 burglaries, we're good. And now they get to count 74 convictions. Discretion should be exercised with transparency, and that's what judges had to do. And I would much rather, I think the kind of conversations Bernardo has been talking about during this panel, judges used to do it all the time, and the vast majority of the time they did it well. And every once in a while, they would do some horribly racist thing that hit the front page, and so suddenly it was, we're going to take the discretion away from judges. I think that was a mistake, and I would, if I were king or queen, I would undo that. And finally, the access to the hospital has become an all or nothing phenomenon. It's another false dichotomy. We don't need to reopen long stay asylums. That's not a good idea. But that doesn't mean that you shouldn't have access to short stay inpatient care when you need it. And that, I happen to know that's a very easy problem to fix. And the reason I know it is we fixed it in Nevada. I chaired a commission for the council for the governor of Nevada, and they had 250 people a night sleeping in the emergency room in Las Vegas. And we didn't fix it 100%, but we made it way better by doing one thing. We raised the Medicaid rate for inpatient psych. It was $425 a day, and if any of you are hospital administrators, you know you cannot even come close to breaking even at that. We raised it to $945 a day, and the next day, Valley Hospital opened a 50-bed inpatient psych unit. And by the way, if it's part of a general hospital, it's not, the IMD exclusion does not apply. That's just for a freestanding hospital. So if the state of Arizona would raise the inpatient psych rate to something that a hospital could make a profit on, they would open more inpatient psych beds, and it would dramatically improve access to short stay inpatient care. Is Governor Ducey here?
All those who would vote for Dr. Dvoskin be king.
It would be a big mistake. Everybody would have a guitar.
What a mess. You could tell everyone it's your fault. So thank you very much for your time with us today. Huge thank you to you three professionals who have carved time out of your busy professional calendars and lives to come here and share information with all of us. Deeply appreciative, and I know the folks here today are as well, so thank you.
Thank you, Ed, Bernardo, Nathan, and Joel, and our panelists from this morning as well. Tremendous discussion today. And some of it I know is a little bit technical and maybe over the typical layperson's thoughts for the afternoon. But we need to learn. We need to learn how our system became so complicated and lost its common sense. And didn't these panelists do a wonderful job of bringing common sense? All of our panelists in this morning as well. And I have to say that we usually always have prosecutors here, so I want to speak in defense of prosecutors. And we did award Sheila Polk last year from Yavapai County with one of our judicial officer awards for the tremendous work that she's doing up in Yavapai County. So I'm not sure what happened, but we thank you for the advice about expanding our borders, and we do the best we can, and we need help. So keep us in mind when you're talking about these topics. We're going to be able to get to lunch probably in about 5 minutes. We will reconvene at 1:30 for the awards. For those of you that are receiving awards, there are going to be boxes out on the sign-in table. You can grab those now or later, but that'll help you get your award home safely. And there's going to be 2 buffets, one out here out these doors and one out by the exhibitor tables. So thank you all, and we're going to keep this conversation alive. Thank you for making it happen. We'll see you back at 1:30.
Nice meeting you. You too.
Great, how are you?
Thank you. I'm Joel.